Bond film rankings. They're like nipples. Everybody has them and some people have more than others. Yes, for those keeping count, this is the third time that I'm making a video ranking of all of the Bond films. This is my first though since the release of No Time to Die, as I like to give Bond films a little while to settle into the chronology after they've been released before ranking them all together. That being said though, No Time to Die took a little longer to settle than I expected. That is a tricky film for me to place in and amongst the rest of the films in this series, but I feel like enough time has passed now, and as I'm frequently asked where I'd rank that final Daniel Craig film amongst the rest of the series, here we go, I'm ready to do it.
Take a deep breath. You only need one shot. Make it count.
Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. One of the things that I love the most about the Bond series is how each and every one of these 27 films is someone's favourite. Well, maybe not that one, but there's always an exception that proves the rule, right? The fact that each, or almost each, of these 27 films is celebrated by someone is a wonderful thing, and I think it speaks to how this series appeals to such a wide variety of tastes. I love seeing other Bond fans' rankings, and no matter what, there is always at least one top 5 pick for every Bond fan that has half the rest of the fandom going.
Good God.
So with that in mind, before we start ranking these from worst to best, a little caveat up top that this is a ranking to my own personal taste, as all Bond rankings are. I'm not here to pretend that this list is some kind of definitive objective viewpoint of the series, and I would be very skeptical of any list or ranking that would purport itself to be that. These films span decades, they play with so many different tones and vibes, so much of what an individual gravitates towards in Bond is down to personal taste. The one thing we can all be united on though is a love of the James Bond character, and I think that that's a wonderful thing, and I think that any Bond fan ranking, at its heart, is a celebration of the enduring popularity and appeal of that character, so please don't lose your head when you see a couple of my top 10 choices. So with all that in mind, we have 27 films to get through, let's get started. Still firmly at the bottom for me, Never Say Never Again has never strayed far from the low end of my Bond film ranking. I know that some fans have a good time with it, but for me, this non-Eon produced Bond film is just a drag, to put it bluntly. I admit that a part of this is down to the fact that I guess I just don't really connect with any version of this story. Never Say Never Again is a remake of Thunderball, and spoiler alert, that 1965 film isn't going to be much higher on this list, and heck, even the original Ian Fleming novel is close to the bottom of my ranking of his books. So yeah, there is just something inherent about this story that I guess just doesn't work for me personally. Connery himself is the real highlight, of course. I mean, it's just really cool seeing him back in the role of Bond one last time, and Barbara Carrera as Fatima Blush is an absolute hoot as well. Love how big and camp she goes with her performance, but that's where the positives end for me with this one. I think a big part of my dislike too is the fact that this film is such a wasted opportunity to try something really different with the James Bond property. Like, these kind of things don't happen all that often, that someone other than the main copyright holder of a specific franchise gets to have a go at making something of this scale. Never Say Never Again could have been a really fun look at an alternative dimension version of the series and the character, but instead it feels like it's just trying to emulate the style and tone of the Eon series, and to much lesser success. Also, just knowing the behind-the-scenes stories about the film, how it was born out of copyright battles, intellectual property snafus, people wanting to stick it to Eon Productions in order to get the financial reward that they feel they've been cheated out of. It gives the film a really bitter taste, knowing where the primary energies behind its existence came from, and as such, it's a very firm 27th place out of 27 places for me.
Damn.
If it's even really fair to include this one, it's such its own weird little thing. But yeah, the only other non-Eon produced Bond on this list, Casino Royale, is a James Bond comedy spoof, and as such kind of sits in a different genre bucket compared to the rest of the films on this list, though that being said, the Bond series seems to be quite happy to borderline spoof itself from time to time, so maybe that's not an entirely accurate statement. Casino Royale is not a film I revisit that often, but when I do, I tend to get a few chuckles out of it. I think it makes more sense to contextualize it in and amongst a whole bunch of other zany 1960s comedies like What's New Pussycat, The Pink Panther and such, rather than being compared with other James Bond films. And hey, it has a great all-star cast going for it. David Niven as James Bond is a fascinating curio to see realised on screen, but Casino Royale is a film that I think is only really worth seeking out for Bond obsessives and completists, and not a film that should ever really be used to, oh, God forbid, introduce a person to James Bond. No amount of lavish production values can cover up the fact that this film is a complete mess. I mean, 5 directors are credited on it. The final product is cobbled together from a bunch of different visions and scripts, and it shows. I'd hazard it might be more fun to watch this one with a bunch of friends and alcohol present, but I wouldn't dare make any of my friends actually sit through this, so I can't speak from experience on that front. Let's just file this one under for the Bond historians amongst us.
Do you realize that anything Uncle James can do, I can do better?
Ah, that will be the day.
Right, now we're really into the meat of it, and Daniel Craig's second Bond outing brings up the rear of the Eon-produced series for me. Quantum of Solace is an interesting one, as this film has really gone through a whole re-evaluation in the Bond fandom in the last few years. I've seen, heard, and read countless video essays, debates, blog posts about it, and I know an awful lot of people really dig this one and see an awful lot of merit in it. Which is really cool, obviously, but despite my many attempts to get on board with that positivity, this is another mainstay of the bottom end of my rankings. There are a handful of action sequences that I like. The David Arnold score is up to his typical brilliance, but there are so many bothersome directing and editing choices that really tank my enjoyment overall. And I know that director Mark Forster intended for the film to be quickly paced and edited frenetically. I know that he wanted it to feel like a bullet and all that, but it just doesn't work for me personally. The intention might well have been to create a thoroughly disorienting experience for all involved, in which case, congrats filmmakers, you succeeded, and I don't like it. I'm also not a huge fan of some of the more pretentious flourishes. It feels like the filmmakers were kind of overcorrecting themselves based on some of the critical praise that 2006's Casino Royale received, so they thought, oh crap, I guess that we're art now, better give the Academy members something to potentially chew on here. But where Casino Royale could achieve deeper meanings and explore some mature themes, it was always still fun to watch, where Quantum of Solace is pretty fun deficient to my mind.
You're just saying that to hurt me.
Okay, I swear, I'm not a Daniel Craig hater. I'll be speaking very fondly of a couple of his films in a little while, but yes, faring marginally better than Quantum of Solace is Daniel Craig's fourth Bond film, Spectre. Another film that I'd describe as being kind of fun deficient, and another Bond film that I feel makes certain overcorrections to its format given the praise of the previous film to its own detriment. Much like Quantum plays like a Casino Royale Part 2, Spectre follows on more or less directly from Skyfall and attempts to explore similar themes regarding Bond's past, but with much less success. Christoph Waltz is a really great actor, and Glorious Bastards is one of my favourite films, and I think that he's phenomenal in that, but his version of Blofeld is severely lacking in menace. And the whole adopted brother thing is such a major misfire. Does anyone like that plot twist? Spectre deciding to try to tie all of the previous Craig films together just didn't work for me. The attempt to retroactively create some kind of wider universe and grander plan, and it just kind of falls flat on its face. Despite all that, though, believe it or not, the film's biggest detriment for me is that hardly any of the action really excites or sizzles in the way that you'd want from a James Bond film. Everything feels so slow and understated in Spectre, and I don't understand how you can make a car chase between these two supercars in a major European city boring, but hey, Spectre achieves just that. This one edges just above Quantum of Solace for me, thanks to the fact that I do think that Craig himself is really great throughout the film. His performance has a wonderful confidence and swagger to it. I find him a very enjoyable screen presence in this one. It's just a shame that the story and action fail to utilize him particularly well.
Yes, it's a bit of a problem.
Thunderball, another mainstay towards the bottom of my Bond film rankings. This one has never fared too well with me, but that being said, there's a lot more in it that I enjoy these days than when I was starting to get into Bond as a kid, where I would probably have been much more unkind to it. 60s Bond films in general just have such a wonderful style and vibe to them, and I think Thunderball is a gorgeously photographed film. It's wonderful travel log stuff, and it just makes me feel like I'm lounging around on some beautiful beach. The film should come with a UV warning. I feel like I'm at risk of sunburn if I don't slather on some Factor 50. However, I do feel like the story drags and the villain's plot just isn't all that interesting. I also feel like it's edited with such aggressiveness that it becomes a bit of a visual assault in some places. The underwater photography is beautiful and very impressive, it's just slow and gets kinda dull after a while. And God help me for saying this, I love John Barry, don't get me wrong, but some of the score during that climax action just really gets on my nerves. It becomes an endurance test to not skip through some of those final 30 minutes. On the other hand, though, it has few Fiona Volpe in it, who is one of the best femme fatales in the entire Bond series, so every cloud and all that.
Well, this is as far as I go.
Now, believe it or not, The Man with the Golden Gun would have at one point been cited as young Calvin's favourite Bond film of them all, and looking back, I'm not quite sure as to why. If only I could go back in time and ask my young self what he found so appealing about this film. What? Oh, the director signed my DVD! Yeah, that probably counted a lot towards my love of it back in the day. But even now, there's a lot that I thoroughly enjoy about the film. Christopher Lee is a top-tier Bond villain, and Nick Nack is a really fun henchman character for him to bounce off of. I'm not adverse to a Bond film leaning more into comedy, so I enjoy a lot of what Mary Goodnight and Sheriff Pepper bring to the film as well. Funnily enough, one of the major downsides to the film for me these days is Roger Moore himself. Now, he's my favourite Bond actor. I love this guy in everything he does, but here, his Bond feels awkward. I think it's because they were pushing him into a meaner, crueler territory, and yes, while that might be true to the Fleming character on the page, it's not a place that Moore, the actor, seems particularly comfortable in anchoring his Bond. Coupled with that is the fact that the film has this general feeling of tiredness about it. It feels like it's being put together by people who needed a bit of a break to recharge some creative juices, and, you know, that's what they would do after The Man with the Golden Gun. 3 years after this film, we'd get The Spy Who Loved Me, and that would provide a great rejuvenation of the series. But on my recent rewatches of Golden Gun, that sluggish feeling has come out as the overriding sentiment for me, which is why it has slipped quite a bit lower on my list this time around.
That's no problem.
I think The Living Daylights struggles the most for me in that I think that License to Kill is a film that better utilizes Dalton's specific skills, and so The Living Daylights kind of feels like the training wheels outing before getting to the Dalton film that I do really, really like. Though I don't want to diminish The Living Daylights too much. I mean, there are some awesome moments in the film. Of course, the whole sniper sequence towards the start is a major highlight, and the action and stunts are of typically 80s Bond top-notch standard. I've just never been particularly fond of the plot, and even after seeing the film dozens upon dozens of times over the years, I can never quite remember the exact details of the opium and the arms and what anyone is getting out of that whole convoluted scheme. Now, I need to make it clear here that I do not dislike The Living Daylights, even though 21 on a 27 item list might seem pretty low, and it is pretty low in all honesty, but that's more of a testament to how much I enjoy the other films on this list, and less of a ding against The Living Daylights specifically. Look, it's a film that I can stick on and have a perfectly good fun time watching, and I know a lot of other fans really love this one and rate it very highly. I can totally see why. I think it's very cool that the film is trying to harken back to something a bit more Fleming. It adapts elements from the Fleming short story of the same name really nicely, though for me, I think it just suffers a bit from a slightly confusing assortment of villains, and hey, there are just so many more other films in this series that I enjoy more, so no offense intended, Living Daylights.
I'm sure you understand.
I have such similar sentiments towards For Your Eyes Only too. It's not that I dislike the film at all, I just find it a little average when compared with other films in the series. It has an awful lot going for it, but in opting for a more down-to-earth tone compared with the films that immediately preceded it, I feel like it just ends up lacking some of the fun, ridiculous energy that I really enjoy from Bond films. And don't get me wrong, it's hardly a dour experience watching For Your Eyes Only, especially when you have Moore on cool, confident, and utterly charming form as James Bond. He's just so comfortable in the role at this point in his tenure, but I do think that the film lacks a more colourful main villain for him to go up against, and maybe it's because the filmmakers were trying to find a different creative footing for this one following on from Moonraker, but I do feel that For Your Eyes Only might have benefited from being a Bond actor's first film rather than a fifth. There's a back-to-basics feeling about the whole thing, and there's a tonal reset that I don't think any other Bond actor has received mid-tenure. It tends to be that the ridiculousness of an actor's tenure kind of escalates up until they reach the end, and then a new actor comes in and kind of rejuvenates things. But no, here in the middle of Moore's 7-film run, we have that reset. But yeah, similar to The Living Daylights, I feel like the film suffers from a not especially memorable main villain, or at least I don't think that you'll be playing as Christatos in any James Bond multiplayer anytime soon. And I say that with absolute love and adoration for Julian Glover. I've seen him in many things, he's awesome, but he doesn't have much opportunity to really chew the scenery here, here, and while his scheme may be much more realistic than Drax's plot to exterminate the human race from his space lair in the previous film, I've always just felt it kind of lacking in stakes, and it's somewhat confounded by the moment at the end where Bond decides that he's just going to destroy the plot MacGuffin, and no one's gonna get it. There's an awful lot to enjoy in the film all the same: wonderful stunts, locations, a really fun and unique score from Bill Conti, but ultimately the story and villain hold it back from disrupting the top tiers of my own ranking.
A very sick joke.
And now we come to the latest addition to the list, No Time to Die. This was easily the hardest film for me to place. No other Bond film hits both astronomic highs and subterranean lows of an actor's whole era as Daniel Craig's fifth and final Bond film does for me. The truth is, for about 90 minutes, I'm absolutely loving the experience of watching this film. I think that the action is top-notch. I love seeing the DB5 utilised in a proper high-octane action sequence. I think that Craig is on brilliant form. James Bond going toe-to-toe with a new 007 is such a rich concept. I love the soundtrack, the whole Cuba-based sequence is a major highlight for me, and Blofeld's birthday party is just the exact right level of camp fun I want from a Bond film. And then the final third or so of the movie hits, and contrivance piles upon contrivance, and it all builds towards the on-screen demise of Craig's Bond, a development that I am not necessarily against in concept, but in execution in this film, it just provides the ultimate downer that immediately makes me regret my decision to watch the thing. No Time to Die's biggest sin is probably that it bites off more than it can ever possibly chew, and as a result it ends up being a collection of half-baked, hastily written ideas. I'm not against the concept of Bond dying, of Bond having a kid, retiring, being in confrontation with a new 007, but nothing hits quite as it should. Most of my problems ultimately end up stemming from Rami Malek's Safin and his somewhat nebulous motives. I mean, look, I made a 2-hour-plus video about No Time to Die and my issues with it, so head there for more detail. I also talk about the things that I love about the film in that video as well, so don't worry, it's not a complete negativity fest. I'm just not going to repeat myself here, much less this video become 2 hours plus. I'll just say that I do not think that No Time to Die is terribly well written, and I think that elements are introduced in relatively hand-wavy ways that just kind of ends up feeling super lazy. Now yes, there are more than just a couple of instances of lazy writing in other Bond films too, and I think in most cases I can just roll with it if I'm having enough fun, but No Time to Die wants its audience to be moved. It wants you to be heartbroken, to be overcome with emotion at the ending, and if you want me to experience those things, you need to earn it. Like, I feel Casino Royale did, I feel like Skyfall did, but No Time to Die is just a film that leaves a really sour taste in my mouth every time I watch it, which sucks because for more than half of the film, I'm really loving the ride. Now, admittedly, I'm an easy lay when it comes to Bond films, because I come into them wanting to love them. I'm a big fan of this series. Of course I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and sit back and enjoy the ride they want to take me on, so it's saying a lot when I come across things in Bond that have me desperately firing my wrist dart gun into the controls to stop the centrifuge so I can get off. And I'm sorry, but that's how I feel in No Time to Die in that final third, when contrivance upon contrivance is being piled on top of each other to get James Bond into a place where he's having to give his own life to save the day, music swelling, brilliant actors giving it their all, and my eyes are as dry as Dominic Green's desert-trekked mouth.
Made you feel it, did he?
No, he didn't, Mr. Dryden, even though, oh, how I wish he did. I wish I could feel the emotional impact of that scene like I know so many other Bond fans do, but I just don't feel like they earn it. The stuff that I'm asked to swallow as a viewer to buy the things that build to that moment is just too much for my throat to handle. Safin suddenly deciding that he's obsessed with Madeline and he's gonna kidnap her, despite having only one interaction with her 25-odd years prior and then having nothing to do with her since. The ticking clock involved with blowing up Safin's island being dependent on some unseen, unknown buyers coming to collect Safin's nanobots, and oh god, don't even get me started on these apparently indestructible nanobots. The Brosnan-era game, Everything or Nothing, utilised the concept of nanobots so much better than No Time to Die did, and I'll die on that hill. Now, this might seem like an awful lot of complaining for a film that's coming 19 out of 27. I've complained less about the films that I placed lower than this, but this is entirely my problem when it comes to ranking No Time to Die. Despite all the stuff that I have problems with, there are about 90 minutes at the front of this thing, which are just some of the best minutes that the Daniel Craig era has to offer, in my opinion. So balancing that out is how I've come to place it here on this list. I think No Time to Die had solid, interesting intentions at heart. Fleming himself toyed with the idea of killing James Bond off in his books, so I don't think that the idea should be off the table completely, but the execution, in my mind, was majorly fumbled here. But then, this is the same film that also has Blofeld's eye being carried around on a pillow and Ana de Armas kicking ass in the best way possible, so, you know, swings and roundabouts.
Right. Back to work.
Oh, Diamonds Are Forever, perennial low-end Bond ranking film that it is, and yeah, I can obviously see why. This is a weird film. It barely qualifies as a spy thriller, and it's really more of a comedy. Say what you will about the added humor of the Moore era, that trend started with Diamonds Are Forever, and to me, it is the most overtly comedic film in the Eon-produced series. And that might be part of the reason why I like it when I'm in the right mood for it. I think that the dialogue truly shines. The script is equal parts witty, ridiculous, and camp, and when you have an actor like Charles...
It's just a jump to the left.
Gray delivering some of these lines, it's just gold for me. I chuckle my way through Diamonds Are Forever these days, but as such, it does exist in a bit of a separate space of appreciation. I have to be in the right mood for this film, and I don't think it necessarily makes for a great double bill with the likes of License to Kill or On a Majesty Secret Service. My point being that it is diametrically opposed in a lot of ways to what a lot of fans would consider films that represent a faithful translation of Fleming's Bond to screen. It's bold of them to say that this is Ian Fleming's Diamonds Are Forever, that's for sure. I think liking Diamonds Are Forever is an acquired taste. It's the campest Bond film there is. That's saying something, so it might make for a good entry point to the series for the John Waters fanatics out there, and while there is a lot I enjoy about it, I wouldn't be recommending this as anyone's first Bond film anytime soon. And yet, I find the fun in it, and I know a few other Bond fans who do as well. It's nice to have Connery back and in a more energized, charismatic form than he was on You Only Live Twice. Jill St. John is a brashy, ballsy Bond girl with some excellent comedic timing, and Mr. Winter, Mr. Kidd are some of the most fun, strange henchmen there are in this series, and just complete the film's surreal, incredibly campy vibe, and it's a vibe that I can roll with if I'm in the right mood.
We deeply sympathize.
Okay, probably the most infamous of the Eon-produced Bond films, Die Another Day has been the subject of a good deal of mockery and derision throughout its life. Despite being pretty well reviewed at the time of its initial release, it was a big box office hit, and hey, I'll admit that I loved it at the time, even if in the years that followed I became one of those people who would perhaps have found bashing in their own testicles with a bit of rope a more pleasurable experience than seeing Pierce Brosnan riding that dodgy CG tsunami wave. There are a myriad of ridiculous things to take issue with when it comes to Die Another Day, and it has ranked low for me traditionally, but over the last year or so, I found myself warming to it more and more, like a frostbitten Halle Berry warming to a Pierce Brosnan rub in a geothermal pool. I can pinpoint to the exact day, the exact moment that I really started coming around on Die Another Day in a big way, and it was the day that I got kicked in the head by that horse. I mean, sorry, it was the day that I saw the film again in cinemas when they did that whole re-release of the entire series to mark the series' 60th anniversary in 2022. Something about seeing the film again on the big screen really took me back to when I was a kid, seeing it for the first time. I was just 13 when this came out in November 2002. It was my first experience seeing a new Bond film at the cinema, and I loved it. I saw this thing 4 times on the big screen during its initial run, and then I remember going into a store to physically pre-order the DVD, and then I absolutely devoured that 2-disc special edition when it came out. I genuinely had a lot of love for this film, and then I started going on Bond forums online and seeing a lot of very justified criticism of the film, and the fact it's such an easy Bond film to take the piss out of as well. I really did turn on Die Another Day in a big way for a number of years. Now I feel like I'm at a place in my life where I can just fully appreciate and understand a lot of the negativity that the film gets, and yet, when I watch it, I find myself having fun for a couple of hours. I think Brosnan is awesome, I think that the action is terrific, the David Arnold score is one of my very favourites, and when I see Pierce Brosnan riding that awful CG iceberg tsunami thing, I can just lightly roll my eyes, smirk, and move on, which is a great deal of relief to my testicles after all these years, I can tell you that much. So admittedly, I've always had a bit of a meh relationship with Dr. No in the past. I've been known to describe it as the vanilla-flavoured Bond film, the template on which more exciting, interesting flavours have been developed over the years, and I do still somewhat hold that viewpoint. I don't think Dr. No will ever be a contender for my top 10 anytime soon, as much as there are many elements that I do love about it. However, if one thing has elevated Dr. No in my mind over the years, it has been reading the Ian Fleming novels and I think coming to a somewhat heightened appreciation and understanding of the James Bond character, the man. And as much as I love and adore all of the colourful supporting characters, fascinating villains, and then also the high-tech gadgets, the high-octane action, wonderful music, locations, all those things, Dr. No is probably the Bond film that showcases James Bond as a character more than any other Bond film does. The whole thing really does feel built up from the idea of really establishing who this man is, his personality, what he wears, drinks, his hobbies. Dr. No is a pretty phenomenal translation of the character from the page to the screen, and Sean Connery is just a totally magnetic presence from the off. He commands the screen. One of my favourite scenes in the whole film is just him quietly and methodically setting up traps and tells in his hotel room so he'll be able to tell if anyone has been snooping around. The man is just so engaging in this film. Then there's also the pure cinematic icon that is Ursula Andress to behold as well. I mean, that character coming out of the water, singing that song, cleaning off those shells, it's an iconic cinematic moment that transcends Bond. I've always found the story to be a bit bare bones when it comes to many of the other films that follow, but now I'm kind of finding that there's something kind of appealing about how streamlined and simple it is all the same. I mean, since Connery's passing, I've been sticking this Blu-ray in the player more frequently than I have ever done previously. It's a fun adventure, but also a brilliant testament to Connery's craft.
That's really most kind of you.
So, if Diamonds Are Forever is the campest Bond film, A View to a Kill must surely qualify as the craziest Bond film there is. The plot for this one is all kinds of bonkers, going from horse racing steroids to Silicon Valley flooding microchip monopoly, all under the design of a crazy Nazi geneticist-produced baby played by Christopher Walken. Need I say more? It represents a really odd mashup of old and new. This was obviously Roger Moore's last Bond film, and the one where I think we can all agree that the overuse of obvious stunt doubles and the aging up of the heavies he needs to fistfight with do nothing but accentuate the fact that he's no spring chicken at this point. And don't get me wrong, I still really love Roger Moore in this film. I think he has an awful lot of charm still, he has an awful lot to give, but I think it's undeniable that the filmmakers are clearly feeling the need to cover some of the cracks that are starting to show as a result of his advancing years. I mean, metaphorical cracks, of course. That wasn't like a joke about his wrinkles or anything like that. For God's sake, if I look as good as Roger Moore when I'm 57, I will be very, very pleased. So it's weird that they decide to cast relatively youthful, eccentric actors in the primary villain roles. Christopher Walken and Grace Jones share such a kooky, oddball energy that hadn't really existed with many of the stern, stoic, middle-aged villains that Moore's Bond had gone up against previously. There are also so many aggressively 80s contemporary elements in this that it feels like the filmmakers really wanted this to be a Bond film of the moment. The whole thing is about microchips. The Q has a robot dog. There's the Duran Duran song. It's such a weird concoction, and yet it works. A View to a Kill is one of those Bond films that I just have an absolute ball watching. It's ridiculous and absurd, and I love it for it. I think that Walken and Jones make for some of the most iconic villains in the whole series, and Roger is just so effortless in the role at this point, even if his stunt doubles are rivaling him for total screen time in this one. The bottom line is, I have an awful lot of fun with A View to a Kill. It's also the perfect drinking game Bond film. Believe me, I've done it. Take a shot every time there's an obvious stunt double or when Roger begins a sentence with the word well, and you'll be needing a week-long visit to Shrublands to recover.
Yes, but if we knew how many wells were involved, we might get a clearer picture.
The reason similar to Dr. No, From Russia with Love is as high as it has ever been on my ranking list. Goldfinger kinda changed the trajectory of the overall tone and style of the series, where Dr. No and From Russia with Love are pretty darn faithful to the Ian Fleming novels on which they're based, which I really like. Now, just being a faithful adaptation does not automatically mean they are better, of course. There are going to be a couple of films, especially high-ranking on this list, that take the title of the novel they're supposed to be based on and little else. So much so that they actually got to publish an entirely original novelization based on a film that was based on a pre-existing novel. How does that work? However, becoming as engrossed as I have become in literary Bond over the last few years has really brought out an appreciation in me for elements in the films that are clearly trying to be a faithful adaptation of the page to screen, and From Russia with Love really does fit that bill. It's also very much the Alfred Hitchcock-themed 007 film. You know, like how Bond likes to trend hop? Well, North by Northwest was a pretty popular film a few years prior to From Russia with Love being released, and the influence is clear in a handful of places. Connery is on magnificent magnificent form in this one, and the scenes he shares with Robert Shaw's Red Grant are just perfectly judged. My favourite chunk of the film is when Bond is on that train. It's half an hour of sheer suspenseful brilliance, and the fight and dialogue with Grant is template stuff for the rest of the series. They will try to replicate the Grant henchman archetype many times over the course of the films, and with good reason. These scenes are iconic, and that character dynamic works super well. But I love the whole build-up to the fight too, with Grant pretending to be a friendly agent, and the fact that the train is host to several different spy factions at that time. Spectre still in the shadows at this point and playing the other sides for fools. It's a really awesome web of espionage that the filmmakers are spinning here, and dare I say, the addition of Spectre into the plot from the book just takes things to another level. A brilliant stroke of adaptation, I would say. The appeal of From Russia with Love evaded me for many years. I know a lot of people who cite this in their top 5, and to be honest, I was always a little bit puzzled by the enthusiasm, but now, like I say, diving into literary Bond in a big way has brought out a level of appreciation and enjoyment for me for the film, to the point where I actually have an awful lot of love for From Russia with Love. I'd still maybe prefer the game to the film though, but I think that speaks more to my love of Bond video games than anything else. It's a really underrated game though, it's awesome. Seriously, go play it.
The whole thing's so fantastic, it just could be true.
It's funny, I feel like You Only Live Twice is somewhat overlooked these days, despite containing an astonishing amount of series iconography. It just seems to never get the same levels of attention as the previous 4 Connery Bond films do, but it's my second favourite of his run, and it has been for quite some time. A big part of this is no doubt down to some truly phenomenal set design. Ken Adam is one of those top-level Bond movie-defining people, and I can honestly just bask in the visual splendour of his work, and his masterpiece surely must be that volcano lair set from this film. It's insane to think that this thing was actually built, it actually existed. I so terribly wish this thing was still around. What I would give to ride around on that monorail. Connery gives a somewhat low-energy performance in places, and that's probably the film's only significant downside for me. Well, that and the really strange tangent we go on where we're supposed to believe that he is disguising himself as a Japanese fisherman. A highly convincing disguise, except for the fact that he's speaking Japanese with a Scottish accent. There are some scenes where you really do feel like the Connery spark is still there though, and hey, there's so much else to relish in. Donald Pleasance's Blofeld is wonderful, the whole Little Nelly sequence is awesome, and I really love the travelogue stuff in this one. It's a beautifully photographed Bond film. The cinematographer here is Freddie Young, who photographed Lawrence of Arabia, so it should be no surprise really that this is one of the most gorgeous looking Bond films. I think You Only Live Twice has a lot of merits, and probably holds a lot more lasting series iconography than it is typically given credit for, but for me, more importantly, I just have an absolute blast watching it.
You can watch it all on TV.
Ah, Live and Let Die. Along with Diamonds Are Forever, perhaps one of the stranger films in the main series. It's a Bond film in which the supernatural actually exists, which is a little strange, but it gives the film such a personality of its own. I've always really liked Live and Let Die, and I think it stands as one of Roger's best remembered, thanks in part to the fact that the title song is one of the more memorable of the entire series. It's amazing how confident Roger is in this one, like right out of the door as James Bond, and also how the filmmakers just kind of treat it as like business as usual, that there's a different guy playing James Bond. I feel like in every other Bond actor's first scene, the build-up to their on-screen reveal is quite a measured and carefully thought-out thing, but in Live and Let Die, it's just Bond in bed with a girl, and then a bit of comedy from him hiding his conquest from M, who turns up at his home. It's one of those films with such a terrific ensemble of villains. Yaphet Kotto is an actor I've loved in every role I've ever seen him in. I'm a big Alien fan, and he's just a force of nature in that film, but all of his entourage here are just brilliant as well. There's Tee-Hee, Whisper, the cab driver, this little knife-wielding guy, Baron Samedi, of course, but even right down to guys like this Adam guy. Like, every villain in this works so well. The music is so unique in the wider series, too. It's an awesome soundtrack from George Martin, and one that I think fits the film really well. I've no doubt the overtly comedic tone to some scenes might not be for everyone. Sheriff J.W. Pepper is certainly an acquired taste, but again, it's that Tom Mankiewicz script that I just find so funny in all the right places, even just in throwaway gags like the sheriff receiving word on his radio that some resident wants him to go and shoot their gone feral dog.
Miss Pearson just called. Seems the dog's foaming all at the mouth. She's got him locked up in the shed, wondering if you'd like to come over and shoot it for her.
Like I say, Live and Let Die has always been a Bond film that I've had an awful lot of fondness for. The boat chase is one of the greatest I've ever seen committed to film, Roger is awesome, and I think the film looks terrific. Just a reliably fun watch for me every time I see it.
Sheer magnetism, darling.
And just skirting the rim of the top 10 is the Bond film I would have at one point said was the absolute worst, my least favourite of them all, but a film that has grown and grown on me over the years, Timothy Dalton's second and final outing as James Bond, Licence to Kill. I've talked many times on this channel about my history with this film. As a kid, I think it was a bit of a shocking outlier. I was turned off by the harder edge, the grittiness, the drugs, the exploding head, the darker side of Bond. This is not the same man who was parading his hover gondola proudly around Venice just 10 years prior, and now it's precisely that darkness, that grittiness that has me loving the film as much as I do. I think the Craig era has somewhat softened the shock of Licence to Kill in the wider context of the series. The fact that this came out just 2 years after The Living Daylights is quite something. It's a very different tone to what came before, but one that I think works incredibly well for Dalton himself. I think that this is his best James Bond performance, and I really gravitate towards his intensity in this film. It also helps that he's toe-to-toe with one of the series' best villains. Franz Sanchez, as played by Robert Davi, is a top-tier character, a more fully rounded villain than what we typically get with Bond films. He's unpredictable in the best possible way. He has an interesting set of standards by which he holds his entourage, which sets him aside from your more typical Bond villain, I think. Licence to Kill will always be a testament to me as to how a person's perception of a particular Bond film can change over the years, be that through a development of personal taste, or how further installments in the Bond series can help you see stuff you might have once overlooked in films previous. 10-year-old Calvin's jaw would hit the floor if he knew this film would one day be a contender for a top 10 slot, but here we are.
Yeah, I like surprises.
Easily one of my most rewatched Bond films. I absolutely love Tomorrow Never Dies for being such a blunt, fast, straight-to-the-point, non-stop action experience. The pace of this film is something else, and the scale of the action is super impressive. This one had an awful lot of behind-the-scenes turmoil going on, apparently, lots of script changes and such, and the fact that what came out of it was something as fun as this is a testament to all involved. It's probably the most classically formulaic of the Brosnan era. I feel like his other films all do something to subvert the format in some way, whereas Tomorrow Never Dies is totally fine just being a straight-up meat and potatoes Bond film, with the notable formula-breaking exception of the Paris Carver character. I really love the concept, though, of Bond meeting with a former flame again, and how that factors into his specific mission. It's a really meaty concept, one that I think the film probably doesn't explore to its full potential, but a lovely flourish all the same. Wei Lin is one of the most kick-ass Bond girls there is, and it makes complete sense for Bond to be paired with someone as physical as her when there's all this action going on. This film must take the record for most ammo fired in all of Bond, and Brosnan is really great in commando mode during the film's climax. One of my favourite action scenes in all of Bond, quite possibly my most favourite vehicle-based action sequence, is this with the remote-controlled BMW. It's incredible how much inventive action, how many entertaining flourishes are concocted in a scene taking place entirely in a multi-story car park, but it's just so much fun to watch. Tomorrow Never Dies is one of those Bond films where you'd watch it and just kind of think, oh, how cool would it be to be that guy with his stylish clothes, with his amazing gadgets, and saving the world, defeating the bad guy. It was a very popular film with me and my friends when we were kids, and I credit a lot of that to the action hero wish fulfillment of it, but also to the fact that Tomorrow Never Dies is just a never-ending delight to watch.
Delicious.
And on a similar note, we come to Octopussy, a film that I've always held in similar regard to Tomorrow Never Dies, and it's probably the only one to rival that film in terms of my own number of rewatches over the years. Octopussy is another meat and potatoes Bond adventure. It just gets to it. It knows what it's setting out to accomplish and does it confidently and smoothly. It's brimming with action and features some typically wonderful 80s era Bond stunt stuff. The whole climax with Bond clinging onto the plane is just so awesome, and that train sequence is phenomenal. I've seen several action films try this kind of thing since, including Skyfall in this very same series, but Octopussy still comes out on top when it comes to train-based action. I think this is one of Roger's best turns as Bond too. For all of the behind-the-scenes stuff about how he might not have actually ended up coming back for this one, I'm so relieved that he did. I can't imagine this film with anyone but him in the lead role, and I think that this film gives him some really juicy scenes to play. It's one where I think the tone is just expertly handled by all involved, exemplified perfectly by the sequence in which James Bond defuses a nuclear bomb dressed as a clown. On paper, it's ridiculous. In theory, it's ridiculous, but it plays so well, and God, it even plays dramatically. Roger knew when to wink at the audience and when the story actually demanded some more seriousness to sell the stakes, and in Octopussy, I just find it all perfectly judged. Okay, I could maybe lose the Tarzan yell, but everything else is great.
Sit.
Okay, I could maybe lose the telling the tiger to sit, but everything else is great. I'm just gonna stop here because I love Octopussy. I do so wish that Peter Hunt had been given the opportunity to direct more Bond films, because Majesty's really does present a wholly unique vision of what a Bond should be. It's a much reappraised film these days, of course, despite it traditionally being known as the one with that one guy in it. And yeah, that's what it was to 10-year-old me, but over the years I have really come to adore it as one of the very best in the series. For as admirable a job as George Lazenby does in his first major acting role here, his performance as Bond has always been a bit lacking for me personally. I think that there are some scenes where he's really awesome, but there's a stiffness to him in other scenes.
Is anything the matter, Celery?
Just a slight stiffness coming on.
Yeah, I'm talking about a metaphorical stiffness, of course, that has me kind of holding this up as one of the very best Bond films with a subpar Bond in the lead. But as I say, I think Peter Hunt's direction is phenomenal, and the film has such a unique, lavish look to it. It feels so rich in detail and character, and hey, Diana Rigg is insanely good in this. The filmmakers very deliberately cast a seasoned, experienced, top-tier performer opposite Lazenby, and while I think the pair work well enough together, I do think of this film more as one that Diana Rigg carries more than George Lazenby does. I don't mean to be too down on George, though, because I do think that he is really great in places, as I say. That final scene, for instance, when he's cradling his dead wife in his arms, I think he's actually quite perfect in that moment. I tear up sometimes still when I'm watching that. It's a beautiful character moment, and a moment from the novel that I think is quite stunningly brought to screen. Majesty's is just a lot of fun too. It has a big, outrageous Spectre plot at the heart of it, the locations are great, it has some awesome action, and some of the very best skiing stuff in the whole series. I especially recommend seeing On Her Majesty's Secret Service on the big screen if you ever have the opportunity to do so. It is a film that has a certain magic when seen in a cinema. It's an absolute epic, and well deserving of its classic Bond film status.
You will not be disappointed.
And now onto something of a modern classic, 2006's Casino Royale, the film that of course launched Daniel Craig's James Bond, and one that I took some time to come around on, I have to admit. I still remember seeing this at the cinema when it came out. I had just turned 17, and the 4 years since Die Another Day felt like a lifetime ago, and I think I just found it a bit jarring that Casino Royale presented a very stripped-back version of Bond. So much of the film is Bond picking up the various pieces of what we know cinematic Bond to be, and at that time, I was just ready to just get straight into it. I didn't need all of the prequel kinda elements that Casino Royale provides. Given some time, though, I really grew to love Casino Royale in a big way, and it's, you know, things that I took for granted at the time that I now cite as being, like, top 10 favourite material. Mads Mikkelsen as Le Chiffre, for example. I just love the guy in this film, and indeed in many other films that I've seen him in. But really, the core of the film for me these days is the Bond-Vesper love story, and I don't think that there has been a better case of Bond-Bond girl chemistry in this series than Daniel Craig and Eva Green. These two on screen are positively electric together. I buy into their romance on a different level than what I'm used to in Bond films, so by the end of the thing, I am truly heartbroken by the tragedy, which is great. Similar to Majesty's, Casino Royale is one of those really rich Bond films where there's just so much detail to relish and moments to bask in. It's a film that I've found really rewarding in my many rewatchings over the years, Martin Campbell proving himself to be one of the very best directors to ever grace this series.
That's it? Anyone want to play poker now?
Goldfinger is a film that, when I haven't seen it in a little while and I'm asked for my opinions of it, I've been known in the past to describe it as overrated. I think that the flaws with it are quite clear and much discussed. Bond spends most of the film incarcerated, elements of Goldfinger's scheme make no sense at all, and then there's weird things like, why are we going on this needlessly long tangent where we're just watching a car getting crushed? I mean, all of these are usual complaints at the forefront of my mind when I think about Goldfinger. And then I rewatch it and I do a full 180, because it's only when I watch it that I'm reminded that, oh, actually, none of that stuff matters, because this is the best that 1960s Bond has to offer. I think it's the best that Connery's Bond has to offer. There's a reason why this film became a template for so much of what followed, and why it was cited for years and years and years as being the very best of all the Bond films. It's one of those really essential films that you kind of need to watch if you're going to really get what a lot of the cinematic James Bond is all about. about. It has some truly iconic imagery which helps certify its classic status. And it's quite right that this film is up there in the Hall of Fame of cinema in general. Goldfinger is a stone-cold classic and very deserving of that status. I'd put Goldfinger up on the same shelf as the likes of The Wizard of Oz, Lawrence of Arabia, Rear Window, Jaws. Like, it is a classic with a capital C, and one of those films that I think you absolutely need to see to enrich your pop culture awareness. It is a collection of incredibly fun, witty, intriguing moments. Pretty much every scene has something to delight in. Yes, even watching a semi-pointless tangent in which a car gets crushed is somehow really engaging in the context of Goldfinger. There's just such a confidence to it, and I think a great philosophy to the filmmaker's approach. I love this quote from director Guy Hamilton in one of the making-of docs.
It seemed to me that if we could do the pre-credit sequence, which is a wonderful piece of nonsense, I mean, where you can go swimming with a seagull on top of your head and you can unzip your suit and have a white tuxedo underneath. If that makes you laugh, let's all now, after the credit titles, go for a great big ride and have fun.
The film boasts an incredible quartet of lead performances from the actors in the villain, henchman, Bond girl, and of course, James Bond himself roles. Goldfinger, Oddjob, Pussy Galore are all brilliant templates in their respective roles, and Gert Frobe, Harold Sakata, and Honor Blackman turn in iconic performances for the series, but Connery, my god, Connery is just a phenomenal presence in this film. If I had to recommend just one Bond film to a person with little to no understanding of what Bond is all about, I'd recommend to them Goldfinger, but with that being said, there are still 5 more Bond films that I personally prefer, starting with one that I just know is going to get me a bunch of flabbergasted comments, but hear me out.
Wow. I'm delighted to be here.
Alright, so I have a lot of nostalgia for Bond of the late 90s and early 2000s. This was the era in which I became a Bond fan, and the incumbent martini sipper of that time was, of course, Pierce Brosnan. I guess I'm saying this because this is me kind of putting my hands up. So, say what you will about childhood nostalgia, rose-tinted glasses, whatever, but I just cannot get enough of The World Is Not Enough.
Foolish sentiment.
Family motto.
I sadly missed the Q-boat on seeing this one during its original cinema release, but for what felt like the longest time for me between the years of 1999 and 2002, The World Is Not Enough was the new one, and it had a glossy sheen to it that obviously really appealed to me at the time. When you're a kid, you're more inclined to like the shiny new thing more. But I also just really enjoyed how this one subverted elements of the classic formula. It felt super stakesy, that MI6 itself was attacked, and that M was kidnapped, that M would just spend a good chunk of the film outside of London. After 18 films preceding this story really felt like it was bringing things really close to home for James Bond, and I loved that about it, and I still do. Of course, we live in an age now where the MI6 building has been all but vaporized, and M is raking up more air miles traveling around the globe than Bond does, so it has lost its novelty somewhat. The World Is Not Enough features some of my favourite action sequences in the entire series. The whole film is just like one big adrenaline shot. There's something about the action in this one specifically that I find so kinetic and fun and varied, from the boat chase sequence on the Thames to the Parahort ski scene to the caviar factory to even this pipeline bit. Like, I don't even know if this counts as an action scene, but that David Arnold score gives me palpitations every time, so there's action happening in my chest at least. I really should see someone about that. I think Brosnan is really terrific in it, and the film is just packed with all of these wonderful, intriguing characters. It's bursting at the seams with all these personalities and faces, and I just love it for it. I also love it for its villain. Electra King is wonderfully brought to life by Sophie Marceau, and I just love the dynamic of Bond falling so hard for a villainess like he does in this film. It gives the actors something really meaty to chew on in a few scenes, and gives the whole villain scheme such an interesting twist. The World Is Not Enough is a film that I can watch over and over and over again, and my enjoyment of it never diminishes. I think it's a terrific piece of entertainment and one of my very favourite Bond films.
All in all, rather stocked.
Fully loaded, I think is the term.
And in a similar vein, a perennial favourite of mine, The Spy Who Loved Me, this has consistently ranked very highly for me over the years. It's a film that I've always loved, and it has just about everything I could possibly want from a Bond film in it. It's kind of the first time in the series that they really lean into the whole 007 teaming up with a female agent from a different organisation who can do almost anything he can do theme, something that they've repeated in a few films since, but just the added layer that you get here from Bond teaming up with a Russian agent during a period where the Cold War was still actually happening. I think the tension and conflict generated from such a pairing is really interesting and exciting. Spy also features some of my favourite locations of the series. As a kid, I was super into ancient Egyptian history, so seeing Bond poking around these old temples and seeing the pyramids and stuff, I still get a kick out of it to this day, and I just adore the whole Atlantis villain's base, and there's the Laparis too. If you can't tell, I love me some extravagant villain layers, and this one has two. It's awesome. The only really notable downside for me with this film is that I don't think that Stromberg is all that strong of a villain. I think that he plays it a little bit too stoically, and I would maybe have enjoyed a little more personality from him, other than, hey guys, water's my thing, you know? But that is a very minor complaint, because this film, good lord, this film is just awesome. I mean, it has some amazing stunts and action sequences, of course. There's the giant battle at the end, which is suitably epic, but the iconic Union Jack parachute jump is in this one, and that whole chase with the Lotus Esprit is just fantastic. There's the underwater stuff, which is iconic and brilliant, of course, but just some of the stuff that they do with the helicopter is just absolutely phenomenal. This right here is one of my favourite action shots in all of Bond. Just the timing of the helicopter revealing itself, the speed you feel is incredible, and then the moment that follows with Bond clocking who the pilot is, and then there's a gesture of familiarity between the two. It's just a tone and a vibe that I adore. Along with Goldfinger, The Spy Who Loved Me, I think, belongs up on that, you know, if there were a Mount Rushmore of Bond films, I think those two would certainly be up there. I think it's one of those essential ones where even if you just want to get a sample of what Bond is about, The Spy Who Loved Me is one that you definitely need to check out.
Nothing more practical than that.
And so we enter the top 3 with a slight demotion from my previous ranking list. It's Skyfall. So yeah, back in 2019 when I did my previous ranking, Skyfall came out on top, and I think that was slightly the product of me being on a bit of a high with it at the time of putting that list together. It's a film that I've seen certainly more than any other Daniel Craig film, and I think a large part of that is down to the fact that my family really like this one, and sometimes when I'm visiting, they have suspicions that I may be a very big James Bond fan, so they'll suggest watching a Bond film, and Skyfall has come up more than once. And they're not necessarily big Bond fans, but they love Skyfall, and I think that this film really does. I think that's a testament to the power and reach that this film has outside of just the Bond series, and I think a few Bond films take on that status, like Goldfinger and GoldenEye are other films that I think transcend the series, and I think Skyfall is absolutely another one of those. I don't think Quantum of Solace or Spectre really roll off the tongues of your average cinema goer, but Skyfall was a raging success when it was released. It's still the highest grossing Bond film of them all when unadjusted for inflation. 2012 was the series' 50th anniversary. Craig had appeared with the Queen herself at the London Olympics earlier that year. I mean, 2012 was really a year of Bond fever, and Skyfall was just the perfect cherry on top of that. This is my favourite performance from Craig as Bond, and I think he really captures a sense of melancholy and malaise that is such a big part of Fleming's Bond on the page. I like that the film plays with him being a little over the hill at this point, even if it's a kinda jarring considering he was supposed to be an unrefined, blunt instrument in the previous film, but whatever. I love how the film goes more into Bond's past, more than any other film in the series had to that point. Given how much the films that followed played into Bond's personal life, I feel like Skyfall may have lost some of that sparkle, but in 2012, this felt like a big deal, seeing the place he grew up, having stories from his childhood relayed and such. I also just love how much of this film is about Judi Dench's M. Like, she was a mainstay, the only on-screen mainstay for me when I became a Bond fan in the Brosnan era up to 2012. I mean, she's my favourite M, and so having a film's plot entirely revolve around her really works for me, which is probably an explanation as to why 2 of the films in which she plays her biggest parts in the plot are in my top 5. Maybe I just need to take a good long hard look in the mirror and ask myself if I'm really a Bond fan or just a Judi Dench fan. Okay, I've got it. My favourite Bond film is actually The Chronicles of Riddick. Skyfall is a film I hold very dear. It's my favourite of the Craig era and one that I can rewatch seemingly endlessly. This film is entering into that same space that Octopussy and Tomorrow Never Dies exist in for me, being films that I just never tire of. And also, just 2012 was a great year to be a Bond fan in general. Skyfall was, as I say, the cherry on top of a sensational year. I mean, we'll brush over the fact that 007 Legends was released that same year.
Seems you've passed by the skin of your teeth.
A recurring thing that I absolutely love about seeing other Bond fans' rankings of all the films is that there is almost always one film in the top 5 that always makes you go like, how the hell is that in anyone's top 5? And I guess this is mine. Moonraker is my second favourite Bond film. Now, I've brought up the subjects of nostalgia and fond memories a few times during the course of this video, to the point that I'm fairly certain I'm going to get some comments griping about how I shouldn't be letting these things factor into my rankings, but films do not exist in some kind of vacuum for me. Just, you know, just like certain foods and locations, you know, can take you back in time, and how your fondness for them in the moment can be enhanced by positive memories from the past, so can films, and Moonraker was the first Bond film I ever saw. It's a film that made me into a James Bond fan, so how can I not just adore this thing to bits? There is just so much I adore about this thing, starting with Roger himself. He is just so effortlessly cool and at ease with the role at this point in his tenure. Along with Octopussy, it's probably my favourite of his performances, and he just fits in perfectly with the tone and vibe that they're going for. Moonraker is a huge, bombastic, extravagant production, and it features some truly amazing set design from series legend Ken Adam. Every penny is on screen, and some of these sets just blow my mind. Much like The Spy Who Loved Me, this film isn't content with having just one amazing villain's lair. There are a few in this one that are just so awesome. I can watch this film with the sound off quite genuinely and just marvel at some of the fantastic visuals. I think it's a really stunning film. Michael Lonsdale's Hugo Drax is one of my favourite series villains. The script gives him so many fantastically witty lines. Lois Childs, Dr. Holly Goodhead, one of my favourite Bond girls. With a name like that, how could she possibly not be? And also, fun fact, I can pinpoint the loss of my innocence to the day by when I realised the Goodhead didn't just mean that she had a good head on her shoulders. And of course, Jaws is back, as inexplicable as that might be, but I'm more than happy to roll with it. I could go on for ages about things I just love about this film, but that opening action sequence in Freefall is just insane. Even today, that thing is about as impressive as it gets. But this is a long video already, and there's still one more film to go, so I'll just wrap up on Moonraker and say, yes, Bond going into outer space is ridiculous. Yes, a hover gondola is batshit. Yes, the film's tonal shifts in places are enough to separate your head from your spine, but it doesn't affect my enjoyment. Much like Goldfinger, Moonraker is a film that, to me, just every scene has so much in it that I just delight in. I have an absolute ball watching this film, and I just have so much fondness for it as well. I would not want to live in a world where Moonraker didn't exist.
Thank you for being so cooperative. A pleasure.
And so we come to the number 1 spot, and regaining its crown at the top of my ranking is, of course, GoldenEye. The film represents something of a perfect concoction of all the elements I want from a Bond film, and then some. When this film came out in 1995, it had everything to prove that James Bond could still be relevant in a post-Cold War world, and so it feels like it proceeded to dial everything up to 11, you know, like, I mean, I'm happy enough for a Bond film to contain one amazing villain, never mind 4. Xenia Onatopp is just iconic and one of my favourite henchman characters. Orumov and Boris are both so much fun too, but Alec Trevelyan is such a wonderful concept, like having Bond go toe-to-toe with a former colleague, 007 versus 006. It gives the conflict such a richness that I've always really enjoyed, and then Natalia is just one of my all-time favourite Bond girl characters. I love how much of the film we spend experiencing things through her eyes. By the time that she and Bond meet, I'm so invested in her story, and I think that's a testament to how wonderful Isabella Scorupco is in this film. Brosnan himself makes for just a phenomenal Bond right out of the gate. He is so cool in this film, and they construct it to give him a whole bunch of iconic Bond moments right from the off. This man was just born to play Bond. There's a highly caffeinated energy to the film, and I credit director Martin Campbell with that, and after watching some of the behind the scenes, it's easy to see that he was clearly the one bringing the caffeine.
Action! 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 Go, 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 go!
That's our director, Martin Campbell.
But as well, there is just a vibrant, kinetic energy to GoldenEye that I just adore. It's funny, it's exciting, it moves at a terrific pace. I think it's something of a marvel of a film. I also think that GoldenEye is somewhat deserving of a modern classic status. To bring up the Mount Rushmore analogy again, I think that GoldenEye probably belongs on there too. It was one of those crucial Bond films on which everything rested at the time, and it set up the series to continue well into a new era of real-world politics. GoldenEye is a very special film for me, and I know for a lot of other Bond fans too, even for non-Bond obsessives. GoldenEye is a name that people know, and the popularity of the video game, of course, helped solidify this title's lasting legacy. It is my absolute favourite Bond film.
Closing time, James! Last call! I'm your pint!
So there you go, that is my ranking of all the 27 current James Bond films. As always, I would love to know what you think about this list, but also your own 27 James Bond film rankings, or 25 if you don't want to go to the non-Eon produced ones, so do let me know your own lists in the comment section below. And of course, if you want to stay up to date on future video uploads, please do scroll below and click the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button. And if you remain subscribed, maybe I'll get around to doing another ranking video a year or two after the next Bond film releases, which will probably be in like 2035 at this rate, but we're nothing if not optimists. I'm also curious to know if No Time to Die was a particularly hard one to rank for anyone else. I have a feeling that it will be a lot of people's very clear bottom of the ranking. I have no doubt about that, but if it's anywhere other than like the very top or the very bottom of your ranking and it's kind of somewhere in the middle, did you also sort of have as much issue placing it as I did? Please do let me know in the comments. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.